Hello class, welcome to segment 4 in lab 3, and in this segment we're going to take a look at something called an array. Now, there are several similarities between lists and arrays. Both of those things can be used to store multiple different entries in just a single variable, but there are a few differences, some more subtle than others, but we are going to go ahead and highlight some of those differences and sort of explain some of the advantages that arrays can offer over lists and vice versa, and also how to actually use arrays in Python, which will also be included. But first things first, let's go ahead and do sort of a side-by-side comparison between lists and arrays. So we took a look at an example of lists in in the last segment, and in this segment we're of course going to introduce the idea of an array. But first off, the kind of data types that you can put in both of them. Inside of a list, you can put multiple different data types inside of a list, and by that I mean you can say put numerical entries and textual entries, which are referred to as strings. We won't cover that in this workshop, but I'll just go ahead and mention that is something else. So you can mix and match different data types. You can put textual and numerical elements inside of the same lists. Arrays, you can't do that. Everything inside of an array has to be the same data type, meaning if your array has numerical entries, then all those entries have to be numerical. If your array contains textual entries, then all those entries have to be textual. But for the specifics of this workshop and also the assignment that you guys will be completing, the only thing you really have to worry about is numerical entries. And since everything is going to be basically a numerical entry, then that means arrays will be preferable to use in that situation. And another thing that's worth noting is with lists, you can actually add items to the list without having to declare an entire new list. And that uses something called the append function. Again, we won't actually cover that in this workshop, but that is something that is out there if you're interested in. With arrays, once the array has been declared, once you set up the array, the dimensions of the array cannot change. If you want to create an array with different dimensions, you would have to complete a completely new array. You can't, or you would have to convert the array to a list, make the changes, then convert back to an array. But once the array has been declared, unless you convert it to a list, then you can't change the dimensions. So if you have an array that's 10 items long, then that array is going to stay 10 items long unless you convert back to a list, add items to it, and then convert back to an array again. But for this workshop, you shouldn't have to worry about converting from a list to array or vice versa. You shouldn't have to worry about that too much. Now, if you have a one-dimensional list, we saw an example of that in the previous segment. If you want to access a specific item, in this case, the very first item, then that goes the name of your list, bracket, and then 0 for the very first item. And then if you've got an array, so here I'm going to assume that I have an array that's called my array, and the way of accessing the very first item in the one-dimensional array is the exact same way as it is a list. You just type the name of the list or the name of the array, a set of brackets, and then you put a 0 in, excuse me, you put a 0 in there to get the very first item. Now, if you've got something two-dimensional, that's where excuse me, if you got something two-dimensional, that's where things start deviating. So if you have a two-dimensional list and you want to pull a specific item out of that two-dimensional list, so you can sort of think of two-dimensional list as a grid or even as a spreadsheet which has rows and columns. That's something that's two-dimensional. In fact, I'll often refer to this in terms of a row number and a column number. So for list, it would be the name of your list, and you have two sets of brackets here. The number that goes in the first set of brackets, like what's shown up on the screen here, that is, excuse me, sorry about that. The number that goes in the first set of brackets here, that is the row number, and the number that goes in the second set of brackets, that's the column number, keeping in mind the computer starts counting at 0. So this would give me the entry that corresponds to row number 0 and column number 0, which it's really helpful to think about things in this way because your data set actually is going to be a spreadsheet of sorts, and we'll talk more about that as we get into some of the later segments. But for arrays, you still have a single set of brackets, but the individual dimensions are separated by commas. So in the case of a two-dimensional list, you have two sets of brackets. In the case of a two-dimensional array, you still have one set of brackets, but the dimensions this time are separated by comma. So to get the same item, to get row number 0, column number 0, for arrays it goes row number 0, which is the first number in this set of brackets here. So I have a comma separating the two numbers. The first number is the row number, and the second number is a column number. So still two numbers, except here we have just a single set of brackets separated by, and the numbers are separated by comma. Here we have two sets of brackets, one for each dimension that we're interested in. And you won't have to worry about this too much, but you can also do this for a three-dimensional list. So that would be 3 sets of brackets, again, 1 for each dimension. And if you're working with a 3-dimensional array, this time you would have 3 entries in this set of brackets here. So in this point, it starts becoming more helpful to think of this in terms of stacks, rows, and columns, but we won't worry too much about that. So this would be stack number, row number, column number, but the main thing that we're going to focus on is 2-dimensional data sets when you actually go to work on the programming project as part of this class. So the main thing that you want to look at is how to access information from a 2-dimensional list and from a 2-dimensional array. And if you try to use the plus sign to add stuff together, if you try and do that with a list, believe it or not, it's actually going to give you a result that looks like this. It's not going to add the individual components of the list together. It's just going to join the 2 lists to form a new list that contains the contents of the original 2 lists. So if you do a list that contains the number 1 and a list that contains the number 2, you try and use the plus sign in that, it's actually going to join those 2 things together to join those 2 lists together to get a new list that's just a combination of the 2 lists that you added together. But one of the nice things about arrays is if the arrays contain numbers, then it will just do that addition for you like you would expect like you would normally expect. Just regular mathematical division. It won't do this weird thing where it joins the 2 lists together. If you add 2 arrays together that contain numerical elements, then you actually get something that's more intuitive. Now, if you try and use the hyphen, which is the subtraction operator, if you use that on lists, you in fact get a lovely error message because you can't actually use this on a list. But you can use it on arrays because as long as the arrays have nice numerical values, then the regular mathematics do in fact work. Although there is a bit of an exception to that rule. If the arrays are not the same dimensions and are not the same shape, then you can't add them together. So for instance, you can't add a 4x4 array to a 2x8 array. Even though they have the same number of elements, the dimensions are not the same. So the dimensions have to be the exact same in order to add the arrays together. And then multiplication. This is where things also get kind of interesting. If you try and do, say, a list 1, 1 times 2, you'll actually just get that list twice. And if you did this list times 3, you'll get the original list 3 times. But with arrays, this again behaves in a bit more of a intuitively mathematical operation. So here we have, this is basically treated as a scalar multiplication where this 2 will be distributed to each item in the array. So the 2 will be distributed to the 1 here, and the 2 will also be distributed to this 1 to get a 2, 2 as a result, as opposed to this weird result that we get from using this on a list. And if you try and multiply 2 lists together, you will get a lovely error message. But if you try and multiply 2 arrays together, it will multiply each corresponding component together to get the result of the new array. And the same thing applies to both the same rule applies to both the addition and the subtraction, although not as much. There are some things you can do to sort of get around this, but generally if you're going to multiply 2 arrays together, again, you would ideally like them to have the same number of dimensions and the same shape. Technically, they don't have to be the same number of dimensions, so you could multiply a 1-dimensional array by a 2-dimensional array as long as the shape of the array is the same. So again, you can't multiply a 4x4 by a 2x8 array, just like you can't add a 4x4 to a 2x8 array. But you could theoretically multiply a 1-dimensional array by a 2-dimensional array as long as the shapes work out. But this will do a nice component-wise multiplication. So this will do the first component, 1 times 3 will give you 3, and that's the result, the first component and the result. And then this 2 times this 4, which is multiplying the second component, and then the second component, the result is just those 2 numbers multiplied together, which is just 8. And then last but not least, division. If you try and use the / on 2 lists, you'll again get a lovely error message because Python doesn't make a whole lot of sense with that. And then the other thing that you can do is with arrays is you can also divide one array by the other. Again, same rules apply. They have to be the same shape. And if you do that, it will again divide each component accordingly. So it'll do this array 4 divided by 2, and then the end result of that will be an array that just has 2, or the result of those 2 numbers being divided.